Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to It's Your Turn from the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. Today, I'm pleased to welcome you. My name is Mbiakop. I'm the Executive Chairman of the ASCI, African Sports and Creative Institute. Today, It's Your Turn, Sports as a Game Changer is a very special one. We have excellent experts coming from across the continent to share their expertise, their knowledge and experience on a key question: how to drive prosperity through the powerful vehicle that sport is. So the run of the show today, we're going to start with Mr. Antonio Pedro, Executive Secretary of UNECA, who will share his opening remarks. And then we move on to the panel. We have three panelists today coming from Kenya, from Mauritania, and from Zimbabwe. So they'll share their experience, as I mentioned earlier, their thoughts, and moving forward, what is it that we can do to drive even more growth across the continent through sports? Without further ado, I'll hand it over to Mr. Antonio Pedro.
Thank you, Will. Thank you, everyone, for this opportunity to engage in this, what will be a very fascinating conversation. If there is one thing that I like, is really sports. Yeah, I mean, I wake up because of time differences early in the morning to watch NBA. I mean, I spend my weekends watching first Premier League, and then I go to La Liga, and in the good old days when Tiger Woods was in his prime or whatever, I wake up and watch him playing golf. So it means this is something that I really like to do, and it would have been interesting to see it more on the continent, where, I mean, we could go to venues in Africa and watch these games and so on. Formula One, and in the long distance past, you had Formula One circuit in Africa, in Kyalami in South Africa. We don't have it now, so we'll have to go somewhere else, and so on and so forth. So this is just one aspect of the problem, as it were. At the same time, we've seen in the TV screens, on many other platforms, that Africa is present in all of these major sports, and in football, on soccer, depending on where you are, this is becoming more and more evident, even in places where in the past you would not see as many Africans playing for major teams. Now you see, I mean, let's look, for example, the Bundesliga. Now there is quite a lot of Africans playing in those teams. So what's happening here? Why is it that we see increasingly more Africans playing outside, and we perhaps don't see the same explosion happening on the continent? So there are some fundamentals that I hope will be the object of our conversation today. And I was very fortunate to have worked with a couple of colleagues when I was in Kigali with our Office for Eastern Africa to try and develop a framework, conceptual framework, to promote tourism sector in the IGAD region. And that was in recognition that tourism is indeed a vehicle for economic diversification on the continent. So, one of the things that, and we're talking in tourism in general, but I mean, sport tourism is, of course, is a component of it. I mean, I have a speech to read, but I don't want to do that. These figures could be shared later with everyone on this conversation. I wanted instead to share with you my own experience with this. So tourism and tourism sector, I mean, is overall neglected in the sense, and perhaps it's because its importance is not well captured in our statistics. So part of the things that we've recognized in this particular IGAD tourism master plan for development of tourism sector in the IGAD region is the importance of having indeed better understanding of the importance of the sector. So throwing a couple of numbers there could perhaps bring the attention of our ministers of finance, and with that, then perhaps more money could go to the tourism sector, in this particular to sports, and that's important. And because I mean those countries that have managed to move up in the value chain, as it were, and where the sports sector has become a very important contributor to growth, to GDP and so on, is because investments were made. So I think we may need to look at that as some of the actions moving forward. The other important thing was indeed the entire conversation about product diversification. It's part of the framework for IGAD. So how can we, of course, building on where we have some comparative advantage, but also invest into diversifying the product, and what does that take in terms of identifying when the talents are, talent mapping, nurturing their talent, and of course providing the conditions to make sure that all of their potential is realized. And then branding is important. Can we have, I mean, an Africa brand that is recognized and that then becomes attractive not only for Africans but beyond? And with that, again, the contribution to GDP will increase, and so on and so forth. So those perhaps as an introduction, those are some of the pointers. And in the context of that particular framework, we also identified the importance of the perceptions. Perceptions matter. Perceptions that the place where the destinations where we are going are secure, are safe, that you'll be able to enjoy the experience without any fear, and so that is part of the cluster. The sports cluster has to go beyond the sector itself, but then looking at all of the other ancillary functions that will make it attractive, that will ensure that people come and to enjoy it. So that means, therefore, we need to invest in safety, in security, in the health facilities, so that those that will attract to our shores, if anything happens in between, then could secure the service that they need to heal whatever they have. So this is just part of the things that I hope today we'll be able to do deep dives in. It's an important sector moving forward. We have 1.3 billion people now. By 2050, we'll have about 2.5 billion people. We are very young. So how can we generate jobs for those young people? I would argue that sports provide huge opportunities. And the sports sector as I've defined, that goes beyond, I mean, the soccer games that you're going to assist, but all the relevant infrastructure that can support that happens, so that we can create the opportunities for those young people. And retaining that talent on the continent is important, because otherwise we'll be glued to the TV screens from outside. I've started by making reference to the things that I watch. Why is it that, and what is it that we need to do internally to make sure that we watch our own thing, the Made in Africa agenda? So how can we develop that brand that would ensure that those 2.5 inhabitants on the continent will be glued to our TV screens, will go to our stadia, and will travel internally, and then with that, the multiply effects then will become much stronger, and that would then, again, going back to what I said, attract the attention of those that decide on the budget allocations, and then we can invest into multiplying all of those values and the value that the sports create. Will let me perhaps stop here, and as my introduction, I would share this the address that points to the opportunities, the billions that can generate in the sector, the initiatives that we can build on. And I think that's important. We have something already on the continent that is happening, that if we try and provide the support to those initiatives, then they can become significant, much more significant. Here, for example, I'm referring to the launch of the Basketball Africa League, that now again is becoming an important feature, and people are going there. It's of course, these partnerships. This has happened because the NBA have identified Africa as the place to invest. Can we identify more of those things that we can build and generate the scale that is necessary to become a feature on the entire global scene of a sports scene. We already, are major players. In athletics. From Kenya to Ethiopia, you go to Olympics, you go to cross-cutting. How do you call it? Other sectors. Other events in athletics. From Diamond League and so on and so forth. From before it was just long distance. Now we are increasingly also featured in 100 meters to 400 meters. We are seeing South Africa quite a lot of interesting athletes there, Simbini and so on and so forth. So we need to look at those things and say, well, what is it that Kenya and Ethiopia are doing well that we can emulate across the continent so that the pipeline expands? So let me stop here, and then we can come back to this and other examples. We have the people that are doing things with us. Entrepreneurs. Let's hear from you, and perhaps then get out of this. Very clear takeaways of the one or two things that if we do right, tomorrow Africa will be on the scene. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Executive Secretary Antonio Pedro. I think it was a very powerful opening remark. So from my side, I retain a couple of keywords that you said. You talk about talent. Yes, on the continent, we have plenty of talent. You talk about brand as retail brand, and we have our expert here, Navalayo Osembo, to talk about brand and also brand Africa as a whole, what is it that Africa has to offer to African, and what is it that Africa is already offering to the world, and what they can do more? The next word that you say, you talk about investment, and that is also, again, the topic of today. How do we drive more investment into the sports industry for us to grow our contribution to the GDP? And lastly, I think you talk about perception. So indeed, perception, because sport for far too long has always been perceived as a recreation, as a recreational space where people just go and have fun. Rarely we understand the value of sport. So before we start, what I thought I'd do, I'd just lay a land and share a couple of figures and context with our audience. First thing first, pandemic. We have experienced one of the most traumatizing impact on the African continent with COVID-19. It has made a major impact across the board on the economic side, but also social side of our societies. When we look at the economic side of it and the rebound side of it, we look at Africa and we compare it with the rest of the world, and it's quite interesting. First thing first, we move from a pandemic situation to an endemic situation, meaning that those viruses will come back, right? And when we look at the numbers of economic growth and growth rates, when we compare Africa to the rest of the world, and when we talk about rebound, around the world, and on average, we saw a 6 to 8% rebound on the Western world mostly. That is for multiple reasons, structural reason, obviously, but obviously the stimulus that has been injected on those different economies. What is it in Africa? Africa was a staggering 3% on average. So our rebound ability was half of the capacity of the rest of the world. So Africa today is facing three major challenges. First thing first, and I think Pedro mentioned it, we talk about demography. We are the driver of the humanity growth, right? We have Nigeria with 200 million people and more. And when we look at the future, by 2050, I believe that one human being out of 4 or 3, depending on the sources, one human being out of 3 or 4 will be African. So we have a demographic challenge, or maybe opportunities, as some people would say. That's number one. Number two, we have economic challenges. We have 15 million people, sometimes 16 million people coming into the job market annually. The traditional industry won't work. That it won't be enough for us to provide jobs for those 15 to 16 million people coming onto the job market annually. And again, as I mentioned earlier, 3% growth rate annually, it's not enough for our continent. We need at least the double. Last challenge is climate change. Climate change, today, Africa produces 3% of the world carbon emission, 3%. That is a super minimum. However, climate change costs us between $7 and $10 billion annually. That is a source coming from the African Development Bank. So we produce less, but it costs us a lot of money. However, when we look at our potential, our assets, I'm thinking, for instance, of the Congo Basin, we are actually the lungs of the planet. So based on those three challenges, we are the leaders of the continent on both public but also private sectors must find innovative ways to address those different challenges. And we believe that sports is one of them. Sports will address the demographic issues, will address the economic issue and climate change issues. So again, for the audience coming in and joining us, welcome to It's Your Turn, Sports as a Game Changer. I'm joined today by 4 amazing panelists coming from across the continent. We have Executive Secretary Pedro, we have Oumou Kane from Mauritania, we have Ndlovu from Zimbabwe, and we have Navalayo Osembo from Kenya. Navalayo, if it's okay, I will start with you. Navalayo is an extraordinary entrepreneur. She's coming from Kenya. She went and studied at LSE, London School of Economics, works internationally, multi-skilled woman. She's coming from the great land of Eldoret, Kenya. Eldoret is well known for producing generations of long-distance runners. Welcome, Navalayo. How are you doing today?
Thank you very much for having me in the session, and I'm doing fantastic.
Excellent. So let's get onto it. Navalayo, you have an amazing journey. How a girl from Eldoret, Kenya, become the most amazing brand, or one of the most amazing brands when it comes to retail in sports. Tell us about it.
I'd say it's different things. First, when you grow up, you don't realize the impact of the people around you. And I did have the opportunity and honor to grow up among a lot of athletes. And so, my dad also worked in the military. So the military is also one of the only employers in Kenya where people are hired for sports. And so one of the patterns that I realized was that there was always a high when someone is famous, and then there's a dip when they don't have money. And that story kind of like repeated itself all over again. And having later in my life studied development, I kind of also saw the same thing about Africa, where I felt like development was very harsh on Africa. Like, yes, we have poverty, we have, some political challenges, but I didn't think that it was as miserable as they made it sound. And so when I finished my studies, I went back home and I knew I had to do something in sports because I've always been surrounded by sports people. I've always wanted to do something in sports, but I also knew it had to be something massive enough to be African and global so that we can kind of challenge this perception that Africa can do it. And so initially it started as a tennis academy, and that didn't work out. And then it transitioned to a running shoe company, which is where we are now, because I realized it's just better to work with people who are the experts, who are in my community, who I know. And of course, it was more challenging to make running shoes. And so that's what I'm doing right now.
Right. But why running? Why moving from tennis to running?
That's an interesting question. One of the things that really blew my mind away was the lack of African representation in the top ATP 100 when I was, an avid fan of sports. And I tried tennis and I realized it's a very capital-intensive venture, and I was trying to do it in the village. And so you need to have the proper courts, the stringing machines, you need to have the proper coaches. We weren't able to get that kind of support.
Can you just say that again, please? That's very, very important. Can you say that again? Capital-intensive venture.
Yes, tennis is an extremely capital-intensive venture, which is why we're not seeing Africans there. And so I realized to be able to make that change, I wasn't going to be able to do it by myself. And so I went to a business accelerator program to help me think about my business plan. And that's one of the best things I did, after discussing my background and the business. I think the obvious question was, why don't you start with what you have and what you know? And that's when I looked at running and I realized, from the running shoe industry by itself is about $54 billion in the US alone. Globally, it's about $134 billion. That's
$134 billion is the shoe industry worldwide.
Yes, and we're talking footwear. We've not talked apparel, we've not talked nutrition, we've not talked broadcasting. So it's an industry with a lot of money. But if you look at Kenya's percentage participation, we're kind of getting in as, only participants. So we are only getting prize money. This is Kenya and Africa in general. And so, the development challenge to me was how can we participate more on the manufacturing side, because that's where the value addition and the money is, so that we are not just leaving the success of sports in the hand of a few sportsmen who also have a lot of responsibilities, but kind of coming in from a manufacturing perspective. And that's how we decided to venture into the performance footwear market.
Oh, that's amazing. I'll come back to you, Navalayo. A lot of great input that you shared here, the value of the market worldwide and the need for major investment when we start, especially in rural areas. So we'll come back to you on that. I'll move on to my next guest. She's actually coming from Mauritania and I'll switch in French for her. Elle vient donc de la Mauritanie, graduate de l'Institut privé, pardon. Elle mène aujourd'hui le développement du football féminin en Mauritanie. Miss Oumou Kane, bonjour.
Bonjour.
Comment allez-vous?
Merci beaucoup. Ça va, je vais bien.
Ça va?
Merci
je crois
pour
que vous êtes
l'invitation.
graduate par ailleurs du Mandela, hein? C'est ça? Je crois que vous êtes graduate du Mandela Washington, vous êtes fellowship?
Mandela Washington Fellowship for the Young African Leader, une initiative du président Obama. Et j'ai été à l'université UC Berkeley, California, pour faire une formation sur le civic leadership.
Excellent. Et vous avez également créé votre...
2015.
Absolument. Et vous avez créé AMAM aussi?
Oui, l'ONG AMAM, Association multiculturelle pour un avenir meilleur, en 2011, pour travailler pour conscientiser les jeunes et travailler sur les actions citoyennes et beaucoup soutenir aussi les droits des femmes en Mauritanie.
Alors justement, là, vous abordez le sujet du sport comme élément de cohésion sociale. Et quand on parle aujourd'hui de conduire la prospérité veut également dire l'inclusion et la cohésion sociale. Est-ce que vous pouvez nous parler un petit peu de vos activités?
Merci beaucoup. Donc, comme si bien dit, je travaille dans le monde du football en tant que directrice du football féminin. Mais dans la vie associative, nous avons toujours pris le sport comme un moyen de véhiculer des messages et on défendait beaucoup les droits des femmes. C'est dans cette optique-là qu'à chaque 8 mars où on célébrait les droits des femmes, on avait pensé pour la première fois en 2013, comment est-ce qu'on peut faire entendre nos voix. Le seul moyen, c'était pour nous de choisir le sport favori des hommes qui était le football. C'est comme ça, nous avons décidé de jouer le football. Ça a été un choc pour les Mauritaniens. Comment ça, elles vont jouer au football? Nous avons mis sur les réseaux sociaux. Mais je vous assure que ça a été un impact incroyable parce que ça nous a permis de découvrir des filles cachées dans des quartiers qui étaient passionnées de football. elles ont entendu l'annonce et elles se sont jointes à nous pour pouvoir vraiment participer. On est allé les voir et nous, on savait qu'on n'était pas expertes en football, mais c'était quand même un moyen pour nous de véhiculer un message qui est fort parce qu'on sait qu'en Afrique, beaucoup de femmes subissent tellement de violence à leur égard. Beaucoup n'ont pas accès à l'éducation, à des soins de qualité, etc. Et je ne veux pas tout citer, mais ce 8 mars 2013 a été déclencheur qui m'a permis aujourd'hui à me retrouver à la Fédération mauritanienne de football en tant que directrice de football féminin. Donc voilà, ça a été quelque chose qui est important, que le sport, c'est au-delà des compétitions et de gagner, c'est un vecteur incontournable sur plusieurs aspects sociaux, économiques et énormément de choses. Vraiment.
Alors justement, je vais rebondir sur ce point, Oumou, parce qu'aujourd'hui, on est en plein milieu de la Coupe du Monde. Nos équipes africaines ont eu des succès variés, mais on a le Maroc là, qui joue le Portugal et on est tous derrière le Royaume pour qu'il brille. Je crois que c'est samedi 10 qu'ils vont jouer.
Tout à fait,
aujourd'hui, vous êtes également référencée comme une des personnes clés pour le développement du football féminin, non pas seulement par la Mauritanie, mais également, je crois, par la FIFA. Est-ce que c'est bien ça?
Oui, tout à fait. On est très ravis déjà de la victoire d'avoir au moins un pays africain qui passe en quart de finale. Et exactement, j'ai été sollicitée par la FIFA. J'ai participé à Women in Football Leadership FIFA IFA en 2018 en Suisse, au siège de l'IFA. Et on était 30 femmes et j'étais moi-même agréablement surprise parce qu'ils ont vraiment aimé la stratégie que j'ai mise en place. Parce que vous savez, quand vous travaillez dans certains pays avec le contexte, le poids de la tradition et la religion, comme la Mauritanie et certains d'autres pays qui vivent la même situation que nous. Mais la stratégie que nous avons adaptée qui a pu permettre à la Mauritanie de faire du football féminin une réalité, c'est quelque chose qui a vraiment surpris la FIFA et du coup, ils ont aimé vraiment ce que j'avais présenté et j'ai participé à cette formation de haut niveau. Ils m'ont même invité à la FIFA World Cup en 2019 en France. J'étais speaker pour aussi parler un peu de cette stratégie pour en faire un modèle pour les autres pays africains. À l'heure actuelle, beaucoup d'associations au niveau de l'Afrique francophone prennent comme référence cette stratégie que nous avons mis en place en Mauritanie pour essayer de vraiment débiter. Parce qu'en Afrique, on oublie souvent, on se focalise surtout sur les compétitions, comment est-ce qu'on peut mettre une équipe et de se focaliser pour participer à une compétition au niveau international, alors qu'on oublie de faire un développement de base dans nos différents pays, commencer par un développement de base avec les jeunes au niveau scolaire.
Des communautés locales, en fait, c'est ça?
Exactement, au niveau communauté locale. Et nous, c'est ce que j'ai constaté dans les autres pays africains par rapport au football féminin. Ils avaient juste une équipe nationale féminine. Nous, c'était tout à fait le contraire. On a essayé vraiment de connaître l'historique du football féminin, comment est-ce qu'on peut détecter d'abord ces joueuses qui sont passionnées de foot et comment est-ce qu'on peut multiplier vraiment énormément de joueuses en travaillant avec les écoles parce que les clubs ne vont pas accepter d'avoir des équipes féminines. Il faut d'abord travailler aussi les mentalités pour accepter cela. Même si moi, en Mauritanie, on a le poids de la tradition, de la religion, mais dans les autres pays africains, il y a ce poids de tradition aussi qui joue. C'est intolérable, inacceptable que l'esprit accepte de voir la femme jouer au football. Même certains pays comme le Nigeria, l'Afrique du Sud, qui ont fait énormément d'efforts, on sent toujours quelque chose qui les freine. Et c'est important de faire des formations d'abord, former les différents coachs, des éducateurs physiques qui sont dans les écoles pour comment coacher les jeunes filles, et choisir des catégories âgées de 10 à 12 ans pour les initier au football en divisant le terrain, etc. Et c'est petit à petit que les choses grandissent.
Merci Oumou. On reviendra vers vous sur la valeur économique maintenant. On vient de couvrir la valeur sociale et l'impact social du football. Mais j'aimerais qu'on revienne ensuite sur la partie économique, sachant qu'aujourd'hui, la Coupe du Monde, c'est un événement qui génère des millions de dollars ou d'euros. Et j'aimerais comprendre et j'aimerais qu'on explique à notre audience l'impact au niveau local, au niveau national et au niveau régional également pour nos pays africains.
Okay,
Donc,
merci.
merci, Oumou. So my next guest, this is our brother from Zimbabwe, coming from the great land of Bulawayo in Zimbabwe, Mr. Nqobile Ndlovu. How are you doing?
I'm good, Willie. How are you?
Excellent. So you're a sports strategist. You created an amazing podcast called Cash and Sports, producing data. And when we talk about any industry, we do need data. We do need data. We need reports. We need all of those intelligence so that we can understand the lay of the land. But also we need those data to produce strategies. Can you please tell us more about Cash and Sports?
Well, just as a bit of a correction, I'm born in Zimbabwe, but now live in South Africa. Cash and Sport is it's not just a podcast or a blog platform. Essentially, it's a company. I worked for about 8 years through Africa, working for one of the largest sports betting firms in the world. We had 7 African countries, and I was in charge of essentially the digital and social strategy element of that. But my job essentially was to go into African countries and work with either teams and federations, and essentially build the digital footprint of this brand. While I was there, I was part of the team that would essentially go into the country and try and get a lay of the land, get an understanding of what was going on. So essentially the company was started as a response to frustration. We would try and get an understanding of what was going on in the different countries. And the countries would be Zambia, Mozambique, Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya. There was a number of others which I wasn't involved in, Cameroon, and so on, others in the northern parts of Africa. And essentially we would be frustrated at the fact that you couldn't find information. I decided in 2019, I had previous experience as a researcher in a different field in finance. And I decided that I wanted to take my love for sport and start switching on light bulbs around the business of sport on the continent. And I started doing that. After hours, I would produce weekly content on my social media platforms to inform the general public around the business of sport. Starting in my home country of South Africa, I researched all of the teams in the major leagues and sporting codes, who their owners are, where their audiences are, viewership numbers, etc., etc. I had no experience, but I taught myself essentially. And
so let me jump in here, because this is very interesting. When you do that, right? And we understand there's such a lack of information across the continent when it comes to the business of sports. Can you please share with this audience, what is the key takeaway? Please give us a lay of the land of the sports business in Africa.
Yeah, so that's a bit of a difficult question to answer, because it's part of the reason why I do my job, right? I think I call myself I switch on light bulb, because the business of sport across the continent is not well documented. Part of why I exist is I now do research for companies. I've partnered with Nielsen Sports. They're my business partners in Africa. And essentially the state of play across Africa is that generally most of the investment in sport in Africa is generally in football. The Basketball African League obviously is as a new player has introduced a new element to the business of sport across the continent. Broadcasting and funding essentially in sport is about 60% or 70% of all the funds come from broadcasting, and super sport being a major player.
Is that right? 50 to 60%?
Yeah.
Okay.
60 to 70%, I would say. Some leagues can't survive without broadcast revenue. So about 60 to 70% of funding to fund leagues across the continent comes from broadcasting, and most of that comes from multi-choice and super sport. There would be others in other parts of the world, Star Times and et cetera, Azam in East Africa. But generally, that's where most of the money comes in.
And maybe,
private equity funding isn't really a thing in Africa at all.
So maybe to complement that, Nqobile, I think when we talk about broadcasting, we're talking about TV networks, and the
Yes.
company that you mentioned, MultiChoice, is dominant through Super Sports in Anglophone Africa. Azam in
Correct.
East Africa, Star Time, the
Correct.
Chinese corporation, is central and also slightly in Francophone Africa. But the number
Correct.
4 dominant force is actually Canal Plus.
Canal Plus, yes.
Francophone Africa. So what we're saying is essentially 60 to 70% of the revenue, this is mostly in football, by the way, is coming from traditional media houses. However, on the Western world, we see an emergence of OTTs, the likes of Netflix, Amazon, Amazon doing a big time job in football, for instance, in France. I think they hired football agent Thierry Henry to improve the quality of their product. So I just wanted to jump in and complement that so that the audience understand the power of the media. What are the other revenue stream when we think of sports in Africa, please?
So,
unlike other parts of the world where revenue comes from gate takings and ticket sales, it's a lot less in Africa. We don't have the infrastructure that supports the type of attendances that you would see in Europe, for instance, where Germany has very high attendances of over 70% capacity. Generally, in even our biggest leagues, most of the leagues where you would get pretty good attendances across the northern belt, Morocco, Egypt, and so on, and those would be generally when you have big matches. In South Africa, for instance, which is seen to have one of the biggest derbies in the world, which is the Soweto Derby, Kaizer Chiefs and Orlando Pirates generally have less than 40% capacity in stadiums for average matches. And then you would only have 80 to 90% or 100% capacity during a derby. Whereas in other parts of the world, capacity from match day taking would be much higher. And then you also get other things such as sponsorship. Sponsorship is a problem across the continent with funding for teams. For the most part, we've been doing research currently alongside my partners on sponsorship in sport across the continent. Women's sport sponsorship is mostly unfunded. From a sponsorship perspective, women's sports generally survives mostly from government funding or grant funding from leagues. And beyond that, it's a struggle for teams across all sporting codes to generate sponsorship revenue from the commercial sector. So it becomes a problem for leagues and teams to survive and for sports to grow.
Absolutely. And Antonio, I'm coming up to you now. I think that you want to say few words. I'm just going to complement what Nqobile just said. So in a nutshell, we're looking at multiple revenue stream in the sports industry. With this focus was mostly football. We can maybe apply a little bit of it to basketball, but when it comes to athletics, for instance, it's slightly different. But we established that we have TV rights as number one source of revenue. We talk about sponsorship as another source of revenue. We didn't touch too much upon merchandising and retail, but we will do it with Navalayo afterwards because that is another sources of revenue. We talk about ticketing, and when we talk about ticketing, I prefer to actually say fan experience because the fan experience does include ticketing, but it also includes concession. So basically, what is the experience of the fan from the moment he gets a ticket, so he expresses interest in getting a ticket, meaning that he goes onto a website, for instance, for the most advanced places. So how do we interact with him consistently for him to spend money? All the way to, he comes to the stadium, he watched the game, he enjoyed the game, he go and grab his burger and his drink, and then he go home. So this entire fan experience is another revenue stream that we want to touch upon, and obviously sponsorship, as you rightfully say. And lastly, licensing. Those are the major revenue stream that we have. I totally agree with you. I think one thing that we want to question for all of you guys, why is it that we have so few people coming in to those stadiums? Why is that the derby are the big ones? You did mention a derby in South Africa between the Pirates and the Chief, but we also have derbies in Congo. I'm thinking of AS Vita versus TP Mazembe. I'm thinking in Egypt, Al Ahly, Zamalek. I'm thinking of Morocco with Raja and others. So derbies are very important. It's interesting how much interest that drags. And we have 80,000, sometimes 50,000, 80,000 people coming together to watch those games. But what is it that makes us lack so many people throughout the season? I believe it's actually product. We need to put top level quality product on the field so that people want to come and consume it. Not only people locally, but people across the nation, meaning that the national TV networks, which we didn't touch upon today, but national TV networks needs to come and cover those games because they are top quality, they raise interest, and also it's entertainment, because at the end of the day, it's also entertainment. I'll pause here. Antonio, Pedro, I think you wanted to share some few words.
Yeah, exactly. So I think, let me start first with what Navalayo said, when she made reference to the army as being the vehicle where some of the potential good athletes would find security, and then go to look at other jurisdictions outside Africa and see what are the vehicles that exist to generate that pipeline. I mean, in many of those countries, the US and the like, they invest a lot in the schools. Being a good athlete, I mean, is a recipe to having a very good access to good universities and so on and so forth. So there's an incentive there that perhaps we don't have in our systems. So to which extent in Africa are we investing in making in the syllabus of our schools from primary and so on, sports an important part of the education of our young kids and the youth and so on. It's not there. So perhaps there's this if there's one recommendation that we have to start early investing into generating that kind of pipeline of people that would have, I mean, interest to create interest in sports by making it a mainstream of the education systems. Now it is again neglected. The other thing I think you've said, viewership. And viewership, I mean, TV rights are associated with viewership. That data, I mean, it's not by mistake, but that companies advertise it because they have the data, the big data these days, help enable them to link the money that they spend in sponsoring the TV, in paying the TV networks that then pay money to the leagues, and so there is a virtuous, I mean, a cycle there that we need to understand. The third point is that we can learn from the leagues even outside. What is in Premier League? Let's pick Premier League that these days, I mean, they have lots and lots of money to pay the athletes because they've invested in bringing in quality. So the Kaizer Chiefs Orlando Pirates derby attracts attention because people go there because they expect to see quality, which is not the case for the other games in South Africa and so on. And the Premier League, by sharing the money across the different teams, have created some sort of average quality that you don't know what will be the outcome of a games even if it's, Manchester City against Crystal Palace, for example. So making sure that in all of those different games that are part of your league, you would find a minimum or an average quality to attract interest, then would create the cycle that we are talking of. Because otherwise, then we will not be able to break that cycle. So we can learn from other leagues which were exactly in the same situation as we are today. If I've mentioned that I speak Portuguese. You go to the Portuguese soccer league there. It's mostly the Benfica Sporting, Benfica Porto that attracts attention. The other games, the stadia are equally as empty as ours. So that's not just an African problem. That's a message that I'm trying to say, that we can learn from that and then create the necessary support. Partnerships are important. I think the owner of Mamelodi Sundowns in South Africa, I think he is investing in creating. He's a champion. He's
Patrice Motsepe,
yeah,
Patrice Motsepe, currently head of the CAF.
Exactly, and he's also the owner of Mamelodi Sundowns, and his wife is the chair of this foundation that is investing money into building the stars of the future. Why could we create those kinds of partnerships? And the private sector themselves, I think, as part of their corporate social responsibility. If you look at the rugby, of course, is big in South Africa. If you go to their stadia, on average, they will have at least 60%. Spectators and so on and so forth, and their money goes there because, of course, there's all sorts of other spillover effects. So we can learn. It requires what Nqobile is investing in, the data, the statistics, information, so that then we can develop the strategies. So I believe we have the ingredients there, and now it's really about developing a very comprehensive and narrative that can enable us to move the needle forward. I made reference to a couple of things that are important earlier, and made reference to rugby as one. And I think I like ce que vous avez dit, Oumou, sur la nécessité, l'importance d'investir sur la formation de jeunes filles là, que demain peut-être on les voit voir Paris Saint-Germain comme les stars au Barcelone, etc. C'est là qu'il faut comprendre qu'il faut faire des investissements pour que demain on puisse réussir à accueillir le fruit de notre investissement. C'est ça un peu.
Absolutely. Thank you, Antonio. Great intel there. Maybe before I move on to Navalayo, just to give some numbers. Again, it's your turn, driving prosperity. I like numbers, and I think it's always important to give some context. 5%. 5% is the sports contribution to the world GDP. 5% of the world GDP is coming from sports as an estimate. Most of that wealth, I think it's more than 80%, is actually located in the Western world, which means Europe and North America. However, when we look at TV, when we watch TV and we watch those games, we see a staggering numbers of African making us all dreams, right? We see the Sadio Mane in football, for instance, or the Mo Salah, Joel Embiid in the NBA, and others in the NFL. What is the number in Africa? In Africa, according to studies, we look at 0.5% of Africa GDP is coming from sports. It is absolutely outrageous. What I believe is that we should launch that road to 5. Road to 5, meaning that we as African needs to get to 5% of Africa GDP coming from the sports world. How do we do that? I think Antonio, Pedro, and Nqobile, Oumou, you mentioned it, education. We do need to have skilled people leading all the way of the value chain. Upstream the value chain with people like Oumou, upstream the value chain with right holders, governance, all the way down to the value chain with fan interaction. So that is retail, that is marketing, events, venue management, etc., etc., etc. So education, I believe, is definitely key. Nqobile, your action from data is important. We absolutely need to understand the context. We need to understand who is doing what, the dynamics between the different key stakeholders, and what is the value, the economic value of every action that we take within the sports industry. Lastly, we talked about football and we talked about tourism from Antonio. Today, the World Cup is expected to generate $4.7 billion. $4.7 billion is the revenue from the World Cup, and $2.64 billion is coming from broadcasting rights. So when we think of sports tourism, we think of Qatar. How much Qatar is going to make out of that World Cup? Well, according to Bloomberg, that is 1.7 billion to its economy. So that is a very, very, very good number. I'll pause here and go to you, Navalayo. Obviously, you know merchandising and retail, but before I go to merchandising and retail, I'd love to have your thoughts on sports tourism. We see an emergence of places, location in Africa. I'm thinking of Rwanda, Kigali in Rwanda, for instance, Morocco, Kenya, with the World Athletics, Junior World Athletic Championship organization. So we see a couple of locations emerging as sports tourism destination. Obviously, I didn't mention South Africa 2010 World Cup. What is your thoughts on sports tourism? Can you please explain to the audience what it is and how Africa, thanks to our assets, our tangible but also intangible assets, how can we leverage on that sports tourism opportunity?
Thanks, Will. So sports tourism is definitely, I definitely believe it's one of the most untapped areas of tourism, mostly because we've been blessed with a lot of, natural features and animals. And so sports sometimes tends to get a backseat, but it is actually the way to go. If I give the example of Kenya, for example, the last data I got was in 2020, where $74 million was what we got from tourism. And that was, sports tourism was tagged at less than 3% of that. So we're just basically focusing on attracting people to come and enjoy the natural experience. Whenever I look at an industry, I'm always looking at it from an economic perspective. So basically you're talking of the supply side and the demand side. And I think if you apply that lens, then you're able to see so many untapped opportunities. So, from the supply side, I can say we are, starting to kind of like get there. So for example, in Kenya, you have the high altitude training center by Lorna Kiplagat. You have also something called the Kenyan Experience, but they're still very tiny when you're comparing to the supply side. And also you're looking at the infrastructure. If you go to other places in the developed world, even just the, the infrastructure to get where you're getting, the quality is really high. And so, while we are kind of like offering that, I do think there's definitely need for more investment, because you can only get more when you invest more. And then on the supply side, in terms of the customer side, it's also the experience. It's not just the existence of the facility. So you have this facility, for example, in a very rural part of Kenya. The hotels are, they're okay, but we can do better. The experience, as you said, it's just, most of it, it's kind of structured in such a way as come, run, leave, but there's so much more we can do from a betting perspective, from a, communal perspective. There's just so much that we can do. So I do think sports tourism, again, not really tapped on because, again, we're focusing so much on what's available to us, but definitely a sleeping giant, in my opinion, if you look at how sports is, kind of picking up and being one sector that is continuously growing year on year and is predicted to continue growing year on year.
Absolutely. So you talk about the direct and indirect expenditure that tourists do when they come to watch a game, or actually athletes when they come and practice or perform at the very highest level or in grassroots level as well. So that's hotel, that's food, that's sightseeing, transportation, etc., etc. All of those sub-segments of revenue, including in sports tourism.
Yeah.
Right? So, and by the way, I think Egypt is trying to host the World Cup in a very near future. I think they're going to bid for it. I think Morocco as well. And that's great to see an emergence and this trend of African countries believing in themselves and believing that they could also host something very special on the continent. I'll just finish on talking about the intangible assets. I do believe that yes, Africa, because of the culture, the art, the music, all of those elements that are so powerful and have an economic value of it. You know, I'm sure Mr. Easy can talk about it, Burna Boy can talk about it. So all of those intangible assets means money. And that is something that we definitely want to grab. Navalayo, let's talk about merchandising and the retail world. Today you launched ENDA, amazing brand. I believe that ENDA has gone beyond African borders. So what happened? How did you manage to do that? What are the lessons learned? And what is it that you can share with entrepreneurs who are listening to us today?
Thanks. So how we became international was actually, you know, that was not how we intended to start. The challenge that we didn't have money to kind of set up a manufacturing facility in Kenya, and we looked at different ways of fundraising, and we clearly were locked out of the traditional ways of funding. And so we decided to go to crowdfunding, which is funding on the internet to get people to support your product in exchange for them buying the product in advance. And when we launched the company this way, surprisingly, over 90% of our customers were from outside Africa. And so it was just an interesting.
How many?
Over 90%.
Wow. 90% of the customers were from outside of Africa.
Yes.
And is it the diaspora or is it?
It's a mixture. It's a mixture of the diaspora. It's a mixture of people who believe in Africa. It's a mixture of people who care about, you know, social justice in terms of, you know, we want a company that's different, that's, you know, a woman is kind of like leading it, or it's from Africa. So there's a mix of people. So that also proved that there is a market for something that's different. And I think right now is a really good time for Africa in terms of just what's going on around the world. So that's how we launched it. And that's how we became de facto a company that was kind of exporting from the word go, but it wasn't the plan. The plan was, if we had money, we would have done otherwise, but it kind of pushed us to a different direction, which I'm always grateful for. So that's how we started. And based on that, kind of like growing the market, it's been most of, you know, doing digital marketing, working with partners, at the same time trying to establish our African presence. So I would say also, you know, our growth has been very much fueled by the digital element. We sell a lot on the website, on social media. We depend a lot on global logistics. So it's really, you know, kind of not seeing the market as I'm from Kenya and I want to sell to East Africa alone, but it's allowed me to see that you can actually be in Africa, and the internet has allowed us to sell to anyone in the world.
Wow, this is powerful. So essentially, your ENDA market is not Africa; is actually the world.
Yeah.
And is that the reason why you're also considering setting feet in America?
So yes, but that's also because the US has traditionally been our biggest market, but we've run operations 100% from Kenya. And so we've looked at the opportunity and said, you know, what if we actually moved closer to the consumer? What if we spent time understanding how the American marketing works? So it's kind of like the next phase for the business, where we say we want to also have a physical presence in the markets that we're selling to. But traditionally, we've been selling it 100% from Kenya.
But this is amazing. Essentially, we're saying that your biggest market share is in the most competitive country when it comes to sports.
Yes, but it's also about understanding the consumer, because the running consumer especially is one who will try different things. And so while you have the elite who are very diehard about what they're wearing, the typical person wants to just try what's new and see what's there. So through understanding our customer, we figured out that if you kind of come in with a very strong brand, if you come in with a very strong promise, the consumer is open to trying your product.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Oumou, je reviens vers vous, Oumou. On a parlé tout à l'heure du football. Oumou, on ne vous voit plus. Hein? La caméra est off. Donc, on parlait tout à l'heure du football. Oh, looks like Oumou has some technical issues. Oh, she's back. Il faut lancer le...
Je suis là.
Ok, super. Merci. Donc, Oumou, nous avons parlé du football et de l'impact économique du football. Donc, je répète les chiffres, hein, c'est 4,7 milliards. Ça, c'est l'argent qui va être généré pour la FIFA et 2,6 milliards vient des TV rights. Aujourd'hui, vous êtes un leader dans la partie gouvernance du sport. Donc, vous établissez les règles, ou en tout cas, vos institutions établissent les règles. Comment, aujourd'hui, la gouvernance du football peut aider à booster l'économie du sport en Afrique? Comment peut-on créer, générer plus de croissance économique à travers la gouvernance?
Merci beaucoup. Donc, je voulais revenir par rapport à ce que Navalayo disait tout à l'heure. Souvent, on a ce complexe de ne pas valoriser les produits que nous mettons en Afrique. On préfère vraiment chercher ailleurs. Et tu vois, elle a bien mentionné que ses premiers clients venaient de l'extérieur. Et le premier soutien qu'elle a reçu, c'est à travers des fundraising. Je parie qu'elle a essayé dans son pays pour qu'on l'accompagne et pour qu'on comprenne son idée. Ça, c'est la première des choses dont nous faisons un peu face en Afrique de manière générale. Et c'est là où c'est important par rapport à nos gouvernants qui prennent souvent le sport juste pour de la distraction. Et je donne juste l'exemple là où je travaille actuellement à la Fédération mauritanienne de football, sous le leadership du président Ahmed Yahya, avec la vision. Aujourd'hui, à l'heure actuelle où on vous parle, nous avons beaucoup travaillé sur la visibilité et la communication pour appeler d'abord aux Mauritaniens à accepter d'aimer ce sport qui est le football. Et ils ont mis en place une FFRIM TV. Donc, pour mieux communiquer par rapport aux championnats qui se font, parce que souvent, nos chaînes nationales ne diffusent pas les championnats qui se font au niveau national. Donc, c'était vraiment une vision, la première des choses, de mettre en place un TV, FFRIM TV, et c'est quelque chose qui est relayé au niveau des réseaux sociaux.
Mais la télé, pardonnez-moi, Oumou, la télé donc vous mentionnez, c'est un réseau digital ou c'est le réseau hertzien?
C'est hertzien là actuellement.
Wow, ok.
Ah oui, hein?
Ouais.
La chaîne, elle est diffusée, ça y est son impact à l'heure actuelle où je vous parle, et surtout donner plus de visibilité par rapport aux activités qui se font au niveau de la Fédération mauritanienne de football. Ça, c'est le chargé de com qui pourrait mieux parler de ça, mais c'est quand même un exemple. Et en plus de ça aussi, on aime toujours chercher, par exemple, comme Adidas, Nike, pourquoi aussi ne pas créer nos propres marques? C'est quelque chose aussi qui marche en Afrique, faire nos manufactures, avoir des industries qui peuvent vraiment produire du matériel sportif et qu'on peut revendre. C'est quelque chose aussi qu'on a réussi un peu à faire ici au niveau national, avec la Fédération mauritanienne de football, en collaboration avec des Marocains, où il y a cette marque avec les différents tennis sportif, tout ce qui concerne le matériel sportif. Et aujourd'hui, quand l'équipe nationale joue, etc., la boutique, elle est là. La boutique, elle est là. Et vous avez parlé lors des stades, quand il y a des champions qui jouent, il faut qu'il y ait un restaurant. Nous avons mis en place un restaurant aussi. Et les gens viennent commander. Ça, c'est quelque chose qui est important que souvent nous négligeons. J'ai eu la chance.
Oumou, qu'est-ce qu'on mange dans ce restaurant? Qu'est-ce qu'on mange dans ce restaurant?
On mange, comme on appelle, fast food. Si les personnes aussi dans la journée veulent manger le soir, la journée, petit déjeuner, la pause. Nous, par exemple, si on a beaucoup de travail, au lieu de rentrer à la maison, nous venons là-bas, où les organisations ou les bureaux qui sont à côté, les ministères, ils viennent commander ou manger leur repas au niveau de la Fédération mauritanienne de football, ou souvent les ambassades les organisent. Ça, ce sont des revenus pour la Fédération mauritanienne de football, parce qu'on ne peut pas rester tout le temps là à attendre à ce que les fonds viennent pour des fundraising, etc., que ça vienne de la FIFA, de la CAF. Il faut aussi avoir une économie qui est stable, qui nous permet de pouvoir soutenir les actions que la fédération elle-même mène. Et ça a inspiré un peu les clubs qui aujourd'hui, qui prennent quand ils jouent au championnat, cette marque qui a été mise par la fédération, tous les clubs qui font leur championnat, ils commandent leur maillot avec leurs différents clubs et ce sont des revenus qui reviennent à la Fédération mauritanienne de football. TP Mazembe, je les ai rencontrés pour la première fois. J'étais agréablement surprise parce que j'étais au Maroc en tant que commissaire de match pour la Confédération africaine de football au Champions League. Et c'était parmi les meilleures équipes, TP Mazembe plus l'équipe marocaine. Et quand ils viennent, quand je fais notre réunion technique, vous voyez tout un staff bien organisé. Vous avez le chargé de communication, le responsable presse, celui qui est chargé de matériel. Donc, c'est-à-dire que tout est bien organisé et ils ont des sponsors au niveau pays parce qu'ils ont réussi à gagner l'amour du public au niveau du pays. Et ça, c'est souvent des choses qui est important. Avoir le public qui commence à avoir confiance, à ne pas avoir ce complexe de seulement aller suivre le match Real Madrid, excusez-moi, Barcelone, etc. Mais comment est-ce que vous pouvez aimer vous aussi à suivre les championnats au niveau national, ne pas avoir ce complexe. C'est d'abord enlever ce complexe et de pouvoir avoir des visions comme eux, ils ont réussi en Europe à avoir les sponsors, les partenaires, à prendre des joueurs au niveau de l'Afrique qui vont jouer là-bas. On peut faire la même chose en Afrique aussi, prendre des joueurs qui sont de la Mauritanie, qui vont aller compétir pour une club africaine, entre autres. Et c'est quelque chose qui peut très bien marcher. Et peut-être que nous n'avons pas eu cette vision. Et avec l'aide vraiment de l'État, les gouvernants, pour mieux communiquer cela. Et c'est là où je vois le rôle de ECA pour amener à ce que les gens échangent pour valoriser.
Absolument, Oumou, il faut retenir…
L'État et les sponsors.
On va revenir exactement sur… Ça, c'est la prochaine question, vous anticipez. Mais on va revenir effectivement sur le rôle que les institutions publiques comme UNECA peuvent jouer là-dedans. Je vais juste rebondir sur ce que vous avez dit. Nqobile, I'm coming to you on that one. We talk about sponsorship. But ce que vous dites, finalement, c'est s'appuyer en tant qu'Africain sur notre identité et valoriser cette identité. Je plaisantais tout à l'heure en demandant qu'est-ce qu'on mange dans votre cantine parce que j'espère trouver des pastels, j'espère trouver du yassa, j'espère trouver du thiéboudjen et autres mets africains et pas des burgers. Donc, ça, c'est une première chose. La deuxième chose, c'est que par rapport au retail et la production des maillots, vous avez absolument raison. Vous savez qu'aujourd'hui, le Mali, le Burkina Faso sont des très bons pays producteurs de coton. On a même du coton organique qui vient du Mali et du Burkina. Donc oui, nous devons absolument créer des produits qui sont totalement en cohérence avec notre identité africaine. Et d'ailleurs, le Nigeria, lors de la Coupe du Monde, l'avant-dernière Coupe du Monde, pas celle-ci, Nike a fait un accord avec la Fédération de football du Nigeria et ils ont battu le record de vente de maillots. Ils ont vendu 3 millions de maillots en une matinée. 3 millions de maillots vendus. Donc, c'est extraordinaire. Et pourquoi ils ont vendu autant? C'est parce que le design de leurs produits reflétait la culture nigériane. Donc, absolument d'accord avec tout ce que vous avez dit, Oumou. Alors, s'il vous plaît, retenez votre pensée par rapport au rôle de UNECA. Antonio Pedro, you'll be asked. Oh, you want to jump in? I see that the fingers is up.
Yes, we will.
Let's about the food, Antonio. Huh?
You can speak in English, no problem.
No, it is a little bit about that. Earlier, you recall I made reference to the importance of product diversification. Even the countries that have nature-based tourism, as Navalayo had mentioned earlier, the experience is very limited because it's only about them going and seeing the gorillas or seeing the big five and nothing else beyond that. Where tourism has made more impact is where you offer to the tourists the total experience. Will, you are, okay, good. I thought I had lost you. So to offer the total experience. And so almost, and your comment about the burgers is really an important one, because if I go to Mauritania, I really want to experience the Mauritanian culture and so on and so forth. So, I mean, in designing what we are offering, we have to look at all of those dimensions. So detail is important. But I want to go back a little bit to the strategies here. And let me pick, for example, a country like Saudi Arabia, very rich. And of course, but most of its wealth is dependent on one sector, oil sector. As part of their diversification strategy, now they have looked at tourism as one of their areas to reduce the exposure to the variations in commodity prices. I'm sure Will and everyone else, you've accompanied the drama with Live Golf League, which is competing against the PGA, the Professional Golf Association of America. And who is behind the Live Golf League? Is Saudi Arabia Public Investment Fund. And the Saudi Arabia Public Investment Fund is, I mean, perhaps second after the Nordic Sovereign Wealth Fund. And it is part of their diversification strategy. So if a country as rich as Saudi Arabia have identified tourism as one of the alternatives to making them a more resilient economy, then why is it that Africa, we are not recognizing that tourism and sports tourism is indeed important? So part of it is indeed getting the figures. And Nqobile, please generate that information and make it public, make it reach through your social community networks and so on to the public officials. For example, South Africa invested about $3 billion to become the first African country to host the FIFA World Cup in 2010. That investment has generated about $509 million as additional contribution to GDP, but more importantly, it created about 130,000 direct jobs. And the benefits, the additional benefits were about $769 million. So that's the kind of numbers that we need to make public and available to our decision makers to then invest in this sector. We are just coming from the African Union Extraordinary Summit on Industrialization and Economic Diversification that was held in Niger, in Niamey. And so one of the things about economic diversification is that indeed it offers, that's why I made reference to Saudi Arabia and the Live Golf League as an example of where in each and every of our countries in Africa, we need to do what we call the growth diagnostic studies. Identify what are those sectors that can perhaps in the short term generate the highest return to investment. And in many of these countries, could be perhaps the tourism sector and the sports sector. And we then need to make sure that that importance is captured in national accounts. And we do that through tourism satellite accounts, so that everyone has a very good understanding of how much the tourism sector is contributing to the sector, and more importantly, how much we can then expand that. And there are a couple of other analytical tools, like, for example, the product space analysis, which will then enable us to know which particular area in the sports sector, for example, is most prone to expanding potential revenues, expanding the job creation, and so on and so forth. So that investment in collecting data, in identifying what are the opportunities, is part of the effort to making sure that we in Africa have the necessary infrastructure, the necessary pipeline of talent to become a major powerhouse in the sports sector. And then everything, I think, will be perhaps much more obvious because the sponsors will be interested, because we'll have quality, Quality, again, going back to what we said earlier, attracts viewership. Viewership attracts sponsorships. And going back to what you've said, Navalayo, again, about crowd financing and also linking to what Oumou is doing in Mauritania. There are some social conscious investors, the so-called impact investors, that are looking for these kinds of opportunities where they can link social welfare, advances of the cause of women, of creating opportunities for young people with invest in sports. Sports provide that opportunity. So we can package, therefore, very credible investment cases and business case for that matter, where we can attract those social conscious investors, the impact investors, to funding that infrastructure, because it's linked to reducing child labor, is linking to reducing the number of street kids, and so on and so forth. This is part of the strategies that we need to pull together, but that requires data, that requires very mature products, and this is where collaboration and partnerships, and I'm very happy with you, Willie, because you brought in this, four member panel, almost everyone that we need to be able to start thinking of this thing differently. We need to break old models and bring new creative packages there and products to attract investment in the sector. And here, we have all sorts of people that are doing that already. So it's about multiplying this and so for that we can generate scale. Thank you. And I've touched a little bit about the role of ECA. It's really about documenting and then creating the platforms to peer learning, sharing this experience with many other parts of the continent, so that then, we will learn by doing, isn't it? Thank you.
Absolutely. And Antonio, thank you for this contribution. We are into sports, and into sports, we go right into it. I have to take this opportunity to ask you, can we today break the news and think of launching an initiative where ECA is taking the leadership of producing information, as you say, maybe launching an initiative where we can all together, we as professionals will come and support you, but where we can together produce reports or book. Us at ASCI, at the African Sports and Creative Institute, we did a book where former Vera Songwe, Fatma Samoura, and others have joined forces to contribute into that book, Économie du Sport en Afrique. Can we imagine that together with your help and under your leadership, we could launch an initiative to address that lack of data in the sports industry?
Yeah, absolutely. The good news is that, one of my colleagues with whom we've worked on this tourism development master plan for IGAD, Geoffrey Maniara, he's a golf aficionado, as it were, and in addition to that, he's our the brain behind all of our work on tourism satellite accounts. So I think we have, first, someone that likes sports, someone that practices sport, someone that is doing work on these satellite accounts, and will be able, therefore, together with the entire people here. For example, we are, together with other institutions in Africa, we are promoting the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area. We have a division here, our Regional Integration and Trade Division, with our African Trade Policy Center, that is supporting our countries in formulating these national CFTA strategies. And the trade in services is an important component of the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area. So to say, yes, Willie, we're ready to work with you. We are looking at, and again, another part of the conversation here is that we can bring other institutions in the UN. For example, UNESCO is in all this business of creative industry, and sports is creative. We go there to watch, how do you call it, Ronaldinho, Neymar, and all of those things, because, they create things that excite us. So it's creative industry. So we can indeed work together in this. I will look forward, therefore, to partner with you and with all of these amazing people you brought to this panel for us to do something concrete. It's not about a book only, it's about making this thing then translated in real change on the ground. So we have to look at what needs to be done. I mean, one step leads to another. All of these things, identifying what is the ecosystem that is required. And we had, I mean, insights from the experts in this area about what needs to be done. So we are ready to partner with you and everyone else that is interested in doing this. Yeah, good.
Well, this is big time news. Thank you very much. I think in the history of It's Your Turn, it's probably the first time that we're cracking a partnership live on digital platforms. So this is amazing. Thank you very much for your trust, and thank you all of you guys to be involved into this. So we're gonna keep on talking about sponsorship because I think the executive secretary talk about it, you know. And Nqobile, I'll come to you, giving some context. Today, the sponsorship money in sport is growing. It's amazing. We have big time deals. The amount are bigger and bigger. People in the Western world are more and more creative in terms of activations. But when we look at Africa, Africa is only 1% of the total sponsorship money spent worldwide. We have some unusual example of African companies like Mukuru investing in Premiership team. So Premiership is the football league in England, for context. So we have African companies like Mukuru becoming shirt jersey partner of football team in the UK. So what's your take on that? What is it that we can do to get more sponsorship money into Africa sports industry?
Yeah, so that's correct, and it's an unfortunate state of events, but it's understandable, and I say it's understandable because Africa's biggest issue with regards to sponsorship is data and insights. I'll give you a practical example. I just did some work earlier on this year for Adidas. They wanted to invest in Nigeria. Their problem is that they'd invested in Nigeria before without getting particular context on the ground of the state of play, a competitor analysis, et cetera, and they lost money. So essentially what they asked me to do is because I've worked in Nigeria, I've got contacts on the ground, I went in and I did research on the ground and I gave them a report back on what their competitors are doing, what the landscape is, and based on that information, they were then able to go back with insight, proper insight. The problem for a lot of brands internationally is that they don't have insight into what's on the ground. Who's the audience? How old are they? What are their spending habits? What do they spend? What do they spend their time doing? What are they interested in? What sports are they interested in? What value can come back to the sponsor? So we need to start as Africans producing more insights that speaks outwardly to say to a brand or to a potential investor, this is who we are, this is what we do, this is who our interests are, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So beyond sport, we need to start also producing community reports that speak to who Africans are. And then brands will be able to see what goes on the continent, and then they'll have a reason to invest. Beyond that, we need to also capacitate teams. We need to capacitate ourselves to broadcast ourselves out there. You spoke about you spoke about something which I think is very underestimated, which is OTT. For instance, Sub-Saharan Africa right now is one of the fastest growing adopters of mobile. Mobile presents a very big opportunity for OTT, and OTT is essentially over-the-top broadcasting, and it presents an opportunity for ourselves to broadcast ourselves out there. Because a big problem that sport across the continent has is visibility. If you're not seen, advertisers don't want to advertise, and therefore you struggle to get sponsorship, right? So the more we can get people watching sport, the more we can, attract advertisers. So here's a stat and an example, right? And you ask for numbers. 40% of the sub-Saharan population has a mobile phone, and it'll be 50% by 2025, right? The total economic value of that number is 154 billion people. That's $154 billion, I'm sorry. And that equates to about 613 million unique mobile subscribers, right? If you want to be able to tap into that audience and you allow for teams and federations to essentially create their own content so that people can watch them at any time, this is a perfect opportunity. Because now you're saying, if you're a small sporting federation, but you don't have a broadcast deal, for instance, with a larger broadcaster, but you want people to still be able to watch your content, you can broadcast it yourself, because Africans have access to mobile, and they use mobile as a primary platform. So that's another way in which you can essentially spread the word and spread viewership and visibility, and thereby also attract sponsorship revenue. An example, for instance, about planning and thinking ahead of sponsorship is when Rwanda decided to sponsor Arsenal, and they said visit Rwanda, which was on the sleeve of Arsenal. People at the time thought it was a bad idea, but there was forward thinking, there was pre-planning. The result was an 8% increase in tourism numbers within the first year. After that, they attracted the attention of the Basketball Africa League, which then invested in Rwanda and increased the number increased attention towards Rwanda. They then built the Kigali Arena at $140 million, which then led to NBA investing in Africa, in the Basketball Africa League, investing in an amount of $186 million, not only in Rwanda, but in other parts of the continent as well, and planting roots. So we actually have to attract people towards ourselves in one way, and also show people who we are in order for sponsors to want to come in and invest. I hope that matrix kind of makes sense.
Absolutely, it does indeed. I'd like, we kind of ran short in time, so I'm going to go for one last round. And Navalayo, I'll come to you, and please, I'll just want to have two questions for you. First thing, can you please give us maybe an example of successful stories or case studies in the sports tourism, maybe in Kenya, or success stories within your sector? And then after, I would love to hear your thoughts on how do we build this sports industry in Africa? What are the key priorities? What is it that we need to do? Navalayo.
Thanks. I'll start with the second question because it's the one I wanted to kind of like answer. Yeah, so I think, you know, I've lived in life both from a policy perspective and an entrepreneur perspective. And I think why I moved was the frustration that sometimes policy takes a really long time to grind the wheels of bureaucracy to make something happen. And so, you know, in regard to the question of how do we, you know, make industry, like sports industry or even sports tourism, like a big thing that can happen, I will take on the entrepreneurial hat because I feel like entrepreneurship is kind of like fast-paced. I would say one of the things we need to do is first create tourism for our people. Right. So most of the time, if you look at a lot of tourism, it's mostly geared towards the external audience and making them happy, as opposed to the internal audience. Thankfully, COVID changed that, and they realized, you know, we kind of have to work with the locals on this if this industry is to survive. And therefore, it's the same for sports. When we are looking at the different players, first we have to put on the hat again of an economist and say we have to look at the demand and we have to look at the supply. Right? The demand is what is going to make our people come to our stadiums. We must come to the practicalities of making sure the security, the toilets are clean, the food is certified like it's good. Like, you know, it has to fit our quality for our own people. And then now you come to the demand side as well. For those who are not able to make it, how will they access it? There's mobile, there's internet, there's social media. Okay, how do we find partners for that? Then you come to the demands, to the kind of like customer side. You talked about concession. How do we make sure that the minute that person purchases that ticket, so that means we make it easy for people to access. We don't make it through some ticketing in some place that is difficult to find. Then what is the experience? Again, you know, you're no stranger to the NBA experience, but it's the experience more than the game, you know, the games, the entertainment, it's more than just a game. So that by the time someone has kind of paid that, the whole experience kind of like creates a value for money. And again, coming to Africa, we have challenges where we're saying, okay, who's going to create the money for all of this to happen? And I think there comes the opportunity of social media. And I really love social media because it has democratized the idea of starting a business and running a business. You can be, you know, looking at the influencer world, you can make a lot of money by just having a lot of followers and doing something that is creative content. And my colleague has mentioned here that, you know, creating your own content, I genuinely believe that is the secret to developing our own sports, in addition to the fact that I've mentioned. Create enough followership. Let's talk about the players. Let's talk about what they're wearing. Let's talk about what they're eating, their regular routine. These are the things that create engagement, so that by the time I am coming to watch, I'm like, I know that guy. You know, you kind of like know all the statistics the way we know for the international players. But to be able to do that, the players have to invest, the teams have to invest, and by investment, I mean a mobile phone. Like, we can all create content, and I do believe that's how you create value, because when we love what we do, somebody else coming into the country will be like, oh, yeah, I want to see the animals and everything, but I heard and I saw on TikTok, there's this fantastic club that does, you know, that does something, like, I want to see that. But we are not able to generate that, I think, through the traditional advertising in newspapers and billboards. I think social media is key. And when our federations and our clubs and our players can recognize that, I think that's where the money is. And touching again on players, because those are people I've kind of like interacted with a lot, you don't see the kind of, you know, bravado for social media that our athletes have compared to the other athletes from across the world. So if you have, you know, we kind of have to teach them as well to own their presence, to own their success without feeling like they are, you know, proud or something like that. Because fortunately or unfortunately, in this world we're living, it's social media, and social media is about, you know, sharing, and it's about how do people connect with you. That connection is where the money is. And thankfully, we can do it without a lot of money, but we need the coordination and the willingness to be able to do that.
Absolutely. I love what you said. You know, the digital technology allows us to leapfrog in unbelievable manners. And as you said, you know, sports has this ability to emotionally connect with people around the world, rural areas, urban areas. This is just amazing. And the platform that you're talking about, like maybe YouTube, allow kids, I'm thinking of the kids, for example, from Uganda, what they call the street kids from the rural areas, filming and recording their steps, dancing, and becoming world superstars, where they never thought of it, but just because of the power of their talent and the platform of YouTube, they become superstars. So you're absolutely right. Athletes have become brands. African athletes are brands, and they definitely need to take that opportunity. Thank you, Navalayo. I'll move on to Oumou. Oumou, I'm so sorry we're running out of time. What else? Ah, pardon, je reviens en français. On est un peu short en temps, mais pour clôturer cette session, qu'est-ce que vous aurez à partager avec les gens qui nous écoutent? Comment peut-on construire cette économie du sport en Afrique? Quels sont vos conseils?
Merci beaucoup. Je pense que par rapport à M. Antonio Pedro, qui a parlé de l'importance du tourisme et le sport, souvent le sport peut jouer un grand rôle pour donner l'image de ce que nous avons à travers les activités sportives, comment nous pouvons vendre l'image de nos pays et de faire connaître nos pays et attirer plus de tourisme chez nous, et plus ils viennent visiter. Et mieux quand on organise des compétitions, nous avons les hôtels qui sont occupés, nous pouvons vendre tout ce que nous avons comme production locale, etc. Et je pense qu'il faut beaucoup s'appuyer aussi sur ça et encourager la production locale vis-à-vis des matériels sportifs, entre autres. Et je pense qu'il faut beaucoup qu'on y travaille. C'est quelque chose qu'on a quand même mis du retard à s'y mettre, et encourager aussi nos gouvernants, dont eux peuvent jouer le grand rôle pour amener à organiser des échanges, des discussions à partir de cela, parce que souvent, ils ne collent pas beaucoup d'importance au sport, alors que c'est un vecteur incontournable sur plusieurs aspects par rapport à l'économie africaine.
Absolument. Merci beaucoup, Oumou. Nqobile, I come to you now. Thank you so much for sharing those numbers and context. Please, your final words. How do we make that? How do we drive prosperity through sports in Africa?
How we drive prosperity for sport in Africa? I think we need support across the value chain. I think we need government support in terms of funding and subsidies. One, I think we need support from legislatures in terms of because at the end of the day, if we want sports to thrive, we need to have fertile ground in order for that to happen, and we need support from lawmakers as well in terms of allowing businesses to start at the grassroots and allowing them to grow. And then lastly, we need some bravery, especially in areas where we're not so strong. Support women's sport. It needs a lot of funding, but it has a lot of room to grow. And lastly, I think that we need to invest in our own production and invest in our own content here. If no one else is going to do it for us, we need to do it ourselves. And speak about what you're doing. If you've got an initiative or a project that's on the ground and you have a business case for it, speak about it, and someone out there can fund it. If no one knows about what you're doing, you're not hiding to nothing. So Africa needs to speak more about itself and publicize more on what it's doing.
Excellent. Thank you very, very much, Nqobile. Appreciate you. I think the final word will go to the Executive Secretary before we wrap up. It's been a pleasure hosting you all today. As a kind reminder, I'll put it here. Allow me, this is the book Économie du sport en Afrique, as we talk about more data, more information on the continent and on the economy of sports. Executive Secretary, the last word for you.
Thank you, Will. Again, first, thank you very much for this opportunity. It was a really pleasure to be with you, Nqobile, Navalayo, and Oumou, to share notes about this important sector. I think Oumou said it all. I guess the benefits of sport go beyond the revenues that we can gain out of it. I think that's the starting point. I think we need to articulate that message quite right, and we need a campaign approach around that. So I think, for example, I mean, I've worked in some of things called Made in Central Africa, and the Made in Central Africa was successful to some extent, or to a large extent, because it was a campaign approach. Basically, being there always on the airwaves and all those things, talking about the merits of producing and consuming locally. And I think the same needs to be done with respect to this. And then the rest is about understanding what it takes. I mean, we used to have, for example, the Paris-Dakar rally because of all sorts of reasons, and that goes to security, the perceptions, and so on. Paris-Dakar now is in Latin America somewhere, and so on and so forth. The brand is still, the name is still Paris-Dakar, but it's not happening on the continent. Let's learn from our success and from our failures, if I may call it that way, and understand what it takes. I mean, the reference to clean toilets and all of that goes back to what I was referring to in terms of the infrastructure that needs to be there. The numbers are important, and we have to bring this to the attention of everyone, not only governments, but also parents. I mean, the parents have a very important role in directing their own kids to sports, in creating the enabling environment, encouraging them to invest in this, because otherwise, if you don't have that family support, sometimes, I mean, the talent will not emerge. So we need to understand all of those things and then create necessary movement for change. As I said earlier, I mean, ECA is available to supporting this initiative, and we are open to partner with you and with the colleagues in this call and beyond to making this a reality. But again, thank you for bringing this to the attention of our audience. And I'm sure through all sorts of other platforms, the message is going to reach everyone. Thank you. And we need to bring the angels. I mean, I know, if you remember in some of our discussions, we need to bring the Didier Drogba, these worlds, all of those people to this conversation. I think sometimes having these role models enable us to move the needle faster than whatever arguments we can bring out there. So let's understand what needs to be done, and you can count on ECA to support this important exercise. It's about diversifying our economy. It's about creating opportunities and jobs for our young people. It's about, I mean, made in Africa. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you very, very much. And the good news is all those sports legends, those sports active players want to be involved. They understand their major contribution to the continent, not only in football, in basketball, in all sports. As you just rightfully say, Antonio, made in Africa. That's a wrap. Thank you very much all. Thank you for the audience for joining us today. That was It's Your Turn, Sports as a Game Changer. So let's change the game together, guys. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you too. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.